American slavery was a horrendous practice by the early American settlers. The atheists point to Christianity as the cause and justification for such practices, despite the teaching of Jesus being completely into opposition of such practices. Whereas the godless societies massacring their own people in good faith was pretty common. The teaching of Jesus were in such opposition to these practices like slavery that it was the sole reason that it was abolished in America in the 1860s.
Therefore, all things whatsoever ye would that men should do to you, do ye even so to them.
If a man say, I love God, and hateth his brother, he is a liar. For he that loveth not his brother whom he hath seen, how can he love God whom he hath not seen?
Inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these my brethren, ye have done it unto me.
The Old Testament does allow slavery, as it was a practice of men. God was trying to reach men. God chose to meet men where they were to ensure the survival of the Jewish lineage and texts. Sadly, the brutal practices of men that relied on slaves to sustain the economy and their daily lives. Case in point, God in Genesis states that he repented making man because of their evil hearts.
And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth.
This is the evil practice of men, not God. How slaves became slaves in the Old Testament is much of a mystery in many cases. Hosea's wife sold herself into slavery, perhaps through incurring debt, supporting addiction, or other causes, but it's clear she put herself in that position, likely through bad choices. The Jewish law, however, brought the first humane practices to the slave industry that didn't exist in its era. It was revolutionary in its era, as it brought humane practices to such an evil practice. Neglect or abuse of slaves required their freedom as a trade that's outlined in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. This is why we know that Exodus 21:20 is referring to the slave that becomes violent or attempts to intimidate or harm the house owner. As there were no police, there were required consequences in that era. However, the laws clearly deter neglectful or violent house owners from harming any slaves due to the death penalty or granting the slaves their freedom. Given the detailed explanations, it's only logical to conclude that violence against one's slave was forbidden in the Old Testament. It was only to be used in circumstances where the house owner was being forced to protect themselves or others. The Bible was used to justify slavery throughout the entire slave trade. However, this was used by taking things out of context. During church services, people relied on the churches to teach them the Bible. They used the Bible as a tool to control and indoctrinate with their own ideas, rather than the real words that were contained in the Bible from Jesus. The 1611 King James Bible was compiled for the early churches. 1619, the black slave trade began, and it was abolished in 1860. So this is evidence that the Bible was being used to justify slavery through the American slave trade. People did not have access to Bibles as there was no printing press, there was no access, and they relied on the churches to teach them from the Bible. The churches decided what to teach, and so thus they were taught. But once the true, unaltered words of Jesus made it to the populations, we saw slavery abolished. This is not a coincidence, as it's undeniable evidence that they were finally able to see what Jesus truly taught, leading to the freeing of slaves. In 1639, the first printing press arrived in the Americas, in Cambridge, Massachusetts. For the next 150 years, this would be the main hub for printing, only available to the wealthy and organizations like churches and those that could purchase a copy of the King James Bible. Newspapers only began to be sold in the 1690s, limiting the controlling information distributed, like the churches did with the Bible, telling the populations what they wanted the populations to hear. Printing presses were scarce throughout the Americas up until about 1820, where they became more available for public consumption, eliminating high costs due to accessibility and quantities being printed through these presses. The population began getting copies of the Bible in their homes, and those that could read finally had the ability to fact-check and access the information they previously relied on the churches to convey to them. And finally, the true words of Jesus became a discussion outside of the churches. We see the spike in Christian denominations following the 1800s when the printing press became more available to the populations. They called this the Great Awakening. Christian denominations started popping up all over, and people were discussing the different ideas of Jesus because they had the words available to them personally by this point. People began truly understanding the expectations of the greatest humanitarian to ever exist, Jesus Christ. They began branching away from the hypocrisy and the lies of the Catholic Church. Things began to change dramatically from that point on. Education was becoming more common in the 1800s, giving people the ability to read the most sold book in the world, the Bible. In 1852, elementary school became compulsory, giving the populations the common knowledge of reading, writing, and critical thinking skills. Reading was the greatest pastime throughout this century, and everyone owned a Bible. The population became educated. Christians finally understood what Jesus truly taught and expected of his followers. In 1850 to 1865, the law passed to abolish slavery. Despite the efforts of the early church to indoctrinate, the Christians finally knew what Jesus expected from them, as the printing press helped the words of Jesus reach the populations. This is reflected in 1878, as it was added into the American Constitution, the separation of church and state, as they attempted to reverse the damage that was caused through organized religion through the centuries. This time frame is undeniable evidence that the words of Jesus built the free society that we enjoy today, as it reached the populations through the printing press expansion as well as education, unraveling the suppression of Jesus' words that was used through the centuries to control the population's thoughts and actions. In 1864, the freed black slaves from Maryland presented Abraham Lincoln with this Bible. As a gift of thanks, they wished to share the hope that lies within them, and the words of Jesus that led to the end of slavery in the Americas. Abraham Lincoln accepted this gift and replied, "I have always acted as I believed to be right and just, and I have done all I could for the good of mankind generally. In regards to this great book, I have but to say, it is the best gift God has given to man. All the good the Savior gave to the world was communicated through this book. But for it, we could not know right from wrong. All things most desirable for man's welfare, here and hereafter, are to be found portrayed in this book. To you I return my most sincere thanks for the very elegant copy of the great book of God which you have presented." Thank God for the printing press.